Hello, and welcome to Eric's Mythical Menagerie. In this show, I plan to discuss mythology and the various stories from the past. I believe that even in today's world, these stories can hold a vast amount of truth and can offer a new perspective on life from people who lived in a completely different time and place. Hopefully, this will help to illuminate some of the constants that we see in the world and help to build a respect for those who came before us. For my first video, I plan to talk about the myth of Apollo and Python. This story is incredibly old and appears in various forms even before the Greeks. The version of the story I am choosing to really dive into would be the version offered in Ovid's Metamorphose. The reason I have selected this version is because, while the actors may be sort of universal ideas, the stage they are on and the actions they take seem to be heavily influenced by the culture in which the myth is developed. This is a fairly obvious observation, but I do believe that the point should still be made. It's amazing how many myths start to become the same when you observe the players involved rather than the exact details. Ultimately, I tend to prefer the Roman telling of the myths, as I believe that they coincide more with what truth is. Since this particular myth is rather short, I will read the Mandelbaum translation of Metamorphose directly. For context, this story takes place right after a great flood has reset the world, and now the earth is creating new life to repopulate it. And it was then that Earth, against her will, had to engender you, enormous python, a horrid serpent new to all men's eyes, a sight that terrified the reborn tribes. Your body filled up all the mountainside. That snake was killed by Phobos. Until then, he had not used his fatal bow except to hunt down deer and goats in flight. He smashed that monster with innumerable shafts, a task that left his quiver bare before the python perished in the pool of poisoned blood that poured out of his wounds. To keep the memory of his great feat alive, the god established sacred games, and after the defeated serpent's name, they were called Pythian. Here, all young men who proved to be the best at boxing or at running or at chariot racing wore a wreath of oak leaves as their crown of honor. The laurel tree did not exist as yet. To crown his temples, graced by fair long hair, Phobos used wreaths of leaf from any tree. The obvious part of this myth would be as a story to tell of the establishment of the Pythian Games at Delphi. These were similar to the Olympic Games. Delphi itself was an incredibly important place for both the Romans and the Greek, and it was said that prophet of Apollo there could reveal truths. Along with the events stated in the myth, they also included artistic ones, which play into Apollo's role as the god of art. Ultimately, though, the interesting part of the myth are the two characters of Apollo and Python and what they both represent. Apollo himself is an incredibly interesting figure and one of the favorites of both the Greeks and the Romans. One may say that this is just because the Romans took from the Greek pantheon, but the Greeks show a much larger affinity for Athena than the Romans ever did. So clearly, they did at least pick and choose from the Greeks. Apollo is the son of Jupiter, or Zeus in the Greek stories, and the sun god. He is also the twin to Diana, the moon goddess. The sun and the moon, being twins, is something that appears all over the place, including the two wolves who run around the world in Norse myth, in Amaterasu and Tsukuyomi in Japanese myth. The Japanese myth actually shows the same Zeus, Apollo, and Diana trinity, as Amaterasu and Tsukuyomi have another brother, Susanoo, who is the lightning god like Zeus. Odin and Thor possibly could represent this trinity as well, but that will have to be saved for another time, since Odin is a little bit odd. From the classical zodiac, Apollo is related to Leo and plays into the idea of the solar king. Now, the relationship with Zeus and Apollo can be rather confusing, but I believe that I've sorted it out in a way. Apollo represents more of the idealized mental form, whereas Zeus represents the sort of highest physical form, using lightning in the heavens as a way to represent this idea. The Greeks, of course, make Zeus into a bit of a meathead for this reason, chasing girls constantly, as the Norse did with Thor. But still, they hold a respect for the amount of physical force that he can hold. Likewise, Susanoo has a similar myth in that he too must slay a giant snake called Yamata no Orochi, but he is the thunder god and not the sun god as Apollo is. However, this does link more directly with the Norse version, where Thor, the thunder god, must fight Jormungandr. However, Thor fails in his endeavor during Ragnarok. One should take into account, though, that the version of the myth that we have is written by Christians and not Norse people themselves. Now, there is also the Greek myth of Zeus versus Typhon, but this does not appear in the form of a true battle in the Roman versions, and so it would seem that the Romans preferred Apollo versus Python. This is something to think about when comparing all of these cultures and what they accomplish. Ultimately, Apollo is representative of the sun, which can also be seen as the higher order in the world, since the sun is used to denote time, and everybody knows time rules all men. So Apollo represents the natural order of things and the sort of higher ideal of what things should be. This can also give insight into how the Romans understood art and why they would choose to produce such an abundance of it. Now, as for Python itself, the snake is a very old symbol of chaos. The first usage that might pop into mind is the snake in the Garden of Eden. Something that should be noted about Python is that the snake is born against the will of the earth. This plays into the idea that people naturally have an aversion to chaos and ultimately do not choose to create more in the world. It is through actions that were intended to accomplish something else, but ultimately the actions still caused chaos to come into the world. This can be seen in the garden myth, as Eve believes that eating the fruit will give her new knowledge. The goal never was to be cast out of the garden, but that's ultimately where her actions lead. Something of note about the garden myth is that it's also mentioned in the Bibliotheca by Apollodorus in Prometheus offering the divine flame to man. Zeus mentions that because of them having the flame of enlightenment, the people will now have to toil in the fields and can no longer live in paradise as before. Interestingly enough, the only temple to Prometheus can be found in Athens. With this in mind, the Romans' dislike for Athena should become a little bit clearer. Just to hammer the point home, the symbol associated with Athena is the owl, which people play as meaning wisdom. However, one should remember that the owl is at its most powerful in the dead of night, and it is still a bird of prey. This can also be seen in the fact that Athena is herself also a god of war. However, to return to the Apollo and Python story, a detail which is very interesting in the myth is that Ovid mentions how Apollo had never used his bow beyond hunting game, but when faced with a primordial form of chaos, he was called to action and had to use his bow to slay it. This highlights that Apollo does not likely go into action, but when he is called to it, he is willing to ask the ultimate price. Another interesting idea is that although snakes are naturally cold-blooded, meaning they cannot survive without the sun and must bathe in it, Python is still the mortal enemy of Apollo, meaning that even in victory, he will ensure his own death. Ultimately, the story plays into a lot of themes about the battle between order and chaos, and highlights just some of the ideas the Romans had on this. Apollo often appears in myths dealing with order as an incredibly interesting character to try to understand. In the next video, I plan to go over the birth of Apollo and Diana, which in some version actually links back to the Python myth. Hopefully, this helped offer some insights into the meaning of this story, and maybe even some insight into your everyday life.